Afternoon, everyone. My name is Gina Pinnell at Central District Health. Before we get started, if you are interested in watching the ASL interpretation, please look for the box up top with that label. So we have solicited from the community a number of questions in advance related to the pediatric COVID vaccine. And we're hoping that you enjoy this presentation today. We've got a lot of content and a lot of good questions that came our way. So I want to introduce you Dr. Sandy Mudge. Dr. Mudge has been the medical director at Central District Health since 2018. She graduated with her MD and her master's in public health from Tulane University in New Orleans and completed her residency at the Family Medicine Residency of Idaho, where she is now faculty. So Dr. Mudge, I'm going to turn it over to you, so go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Gina. And thank you to everybody who's spending time with us today on this lovely rainy day here in Boise. And also for those of you who submitted questions ahead of time, I appreciate the interaction. And also, I know how much all of us are struggling right now with this challenge of how do we keep our families, our communities, and our children safe during this COVID-19 pandemic. It's been going on for more than a year and a half. And that's why we're having this presentation today, to give you some information and hopefully help you to make whatever the best decision is for you and your family. Next slide, please. So when I think about this in relations to my child, I think about 5 different buckets of things I need to protect my child from. So one is, and we're going to talk about all of these in a little bit more detail, but one is serious illness from COVID infection itself. One is from the syndrome called multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. One is, how do we protect our larger community? So through population or herd immunity. One is the potential for long COVID. And one is, what are other potential long-term outcomes of having a COVID infection that we don't yet know about? Next slide, please. So number 1 under there, and why we're talking about vaccinating children, is to protect children from serious illness from COVID infection. We're very fortunate that this illness so far has been overall pretty mild in children. But we don't know that it will stay that way, as the virus has mutated many times already. And we do know that some children are affected in a serious manner. Over 65,000 children ages 0 to 17 have been hospitalized, according to the CDC data. That's 262 in Idaho, according to our state's dashboard, and 67 that are residing in our 4 counties that are included in Central District 4. It makes up about 0.1 to 2% of all COVID cases end up hospitalized in kids. Obviously, that number is can be higher in adults. About 2/3 of the children that are being hospitalized have a chronic health condition. It can be as simple as obesity is their chronic health condition, or something like a lung condition like asthma. But about 1/3 have no known chronic health conditions, and they still end up in the hospital. And we're not quite sure why and who that will be. There's been nearly 900 deaths in the population ages 0 to 17, and about 189 in ages 5 to 11. Fortunately, we've had no child deaths in Idaho. Next slide, please. And this is the data from the CDC, and this isn't probably very complete because we know that all states are reporting in different manners. It's voluntary. But the information that we have is at least a couple million cases of COVID reported in ages 5 to 11. Obviously, if kids haven't been tested, they wouldn't be part of this data. Also, the 189 deaths in this age group. Next slide, please. In Idaho, we've seen about 40,000 cases in children reported. That's about 15 or 16,000 in kids in population age 5 to 11. Next slide, please. And this shows the deaths due to COVID in Idaho. Fortunately, as I mentioned, no deaths due to COVID here in Idaho, in the children population, although we have seen in this latest Delta variant more younger adults ending up hospitalized and then dying in the hospital in the 18 to 29 age range. Next slide, please. For hospitalization in Idaho due to COVID-19, we've had 262, and in that younger than age 18 group, and like I mentioned before, I believe it was in the 60s here in Central District Health. Next slide, please. So the second bucket or reason that I think about vaccinating children for protection would be for this phenomena called multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. We've had more than 5,500 cases in the US. Only 37 of those have been in Idaho, and 17 of those 37 have been here in the Central District Health region. The median age is about age 9, so it's the population we're talking about. And 2/3 of those children end up in the intensive care unit, and about 1 to 2% end up dying from this syndrome. Next slide, please. So what is multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children? Well, it is an inflammation that can infect multiple major organs, such as the heart, especially lung, kidneys, brain, eyes, etc. Tends to crop up 2 to 6 weeks after the initial COVID infection. And that infection may be severe, but it could also be completely asymptomatic. Sometimes kids don't even know that they were infected until they're tested later. Luckily, it is fairly rare, but as I mentioned before, it can be quite serious, and symptoms can include fever, abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, bloodshot eyes, and feeling very tired. Next slide, please. Third would be to protect children from long COVID or long haul COVID or post-COVID syndrome. There's a lot of different names for it. This is still developing. We still don't have a lot of really great information or research on this, especially in children. There's various studies that have estimated up to very few to 50% of kids develop this syndrome. And they typically are using the criteria of symptoms longer than 4 weeks after the COVID infection. It is a little bit hard because there's a lot of symptoms that fall under this, but most symptoms kind of come down to in children: aches and pains, joint problems, problems breathing or chronic cough, decreased exercise tolerance. So we've seen a lot of reports of athletes who are no longer being able to participate in their high school sports, for example. Brain fog, so kids that used to be doing really well academically no longer being able to perform like that after the COVID infection. Problems sleeping, chronic fatigue, headache, and mood symptoms. From what I've seen, somewhere between most people feel like somewhere in the 10 to 20 or 30% range is probably what this is going to fall out of who does continue to experience symptoms after COVID in children. And this can be after asymptomatic cases. It can be after symptomatic cases. So it doesn't matter how severe the case is. One might continue to have these symptoms after the COVID infection, but they could also have a pause in symptoms and then they develop later. Next slide, please. So the next bucket would be to protect children from any yet unknown downstream effects. We have absolutely no idea if this will be an issue, but there is a potential. There's evidence from this from prior illnesses and infections. Some are getting chickenpox as a child and then developing shingles, typically in midlife, having heart issues from rheumatic fever, or having a brain inflammation called encephalitis, which invariably leads to death after being ill with measles in a small percentage of children. So we don't know if this will be something that comes up from COVID, but it is a possibility, so something for us to consider. Next slide, please. And then lastly, and probably most importantly to many of us, is how do we protect the rest of our community? And that is with population or herd immunity. The less people that this virus can spread to, the less people that will be infected, the less people who will end up hospitalized, the less people who will end up dying. And also the less opportunity for the virus to mutate and become something more infectious, more deadly, or hopefully never more deadly to children. We know that kids can if they're infected, even if they have a mild case, they can still infect other members of their household, and they can take it to school or their daycare or preschool. And without getting this large level of either people vaccinated or having natural immunity, we'll continue to fight these battles of quarantining, being potentially out of school, masking, etc. So this is a big reason to consider vaccination. Next slide, please. And I'll let Gina kind of take it from here.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mudge. Dustin, next slide, please. So one of the things that we do here is a concern about the rapid nature of the COVID vaccines. So can you talk about how they got approved so quickly and just a little bit about that process?
Absolutely. So normal kind of traditional timeline can be years, 10, 15 years to get a vaccine approved. And through Project Warp Speed at the beginning of the pandemic, we were able to help vaccine manufacturers do this process much more quickly by overlapping phases. So basically, we did things all at the same time so that as soon as it was considered safe and approved by the FDA, we could move towards getting them the shots in arms. One thing nice about this situation is that the mRNA vaccines, which is what we're primarily talking about today, because the Pfizer vaccine is an mRNA vaccine and is the only one approved for children ages 5 to 11, is that this technology has been around for over 20 years. It was developed initially to meet the challenge of the SARS outbreak and then the MERS outbreak. So they have actually had people undergoing clinical trials way back 20 years ago. Those outbreaks ended up not being very substantial on humans, thankfully. So they didn't end up needing to mass market this, but because the technology existed, we were able to get through the scientific preclinical stuff pretty quickly. They isolated this particular virus, the COVID-19 virus, and then we're able to start going right into the phase trials. So doing small studies for safety, what dosages were appropriate, side effects, etc. They did overlapped phase 2 and phase 3 trials, and then all throughout this, the FDA was evaluating their work, and they were also, through the help of the federal government, manufacturing even before they had gotten full FDA approval. So as soon as they were able to get the data from the studies, have the FDA approve it, they were able to get the shots being shipped out to local health departments and other places to give the vaccines. Slide.
Thank you so much. So the term emergency use authorization is not new, but it's definitely used a lot more often now during the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, as you mentioned, this is something that's been around much prior to this COVID-19 pandemic. And the reason why is we needed some sort of mechanism so that we could have medical countermeasures in a public health emergency, such as our current COVID-19 emergency. So even though this is a more rapid approval, there are still strict criteria that need to be met for consideration of this process through the FDA. And there's also independent data safety review boards who are, along with the FDA and many other people, looking through all of the data that's being given to us by the manufacturers. There are some minimum requirements, such as 3,000 participants and at least 2 months follow-up for vaccines under the emergency use authorization. And when this was first, when the mRNA vaccines first came out, both the Moderna and the Pfizer mRNA vaccines, their original studies had 90,000 participants. And now, of course, there's been hundreds of millions of people around the world who've gotten mRNA vaccines.
Great. Thank you. Dustin, next slide. So does the Pfizer biotech vaccine have the EUA or full approval from the FDA?
So this is a great question that came up. And so initially on December 11th of 2020, the FDA issued the EUA approval for the Pfizer BioNTech for ages 16 and up. And then that was expanded to age 12 and up on May 10th in 2021. In August, Pfizer actually submitted the full biologics license application for the COVID-19 vaccine for ages 16 and up. So they'd compiled all the data, those hundreds of millions of shots, all the rest of their scientific data were all compiled and given to the FDA and requested full approval, and it was granted. They have not yet done that for ages 5 through 15. Those are still under emergency use authorization. However, the plan is for them to also get full approval over time.
Great, thank you. Next slide. And this next question has to do with just the nature of the mRNA vaccine and how it actually works. We have a lot of questions coming our way about that.
Yeah, this is not necessarily new technology, but it's the first time that this kind of vaccine has been mass produced. Like I mentioned, it initially was being made 20 years ago, but it's a very overall clean technology. It's mostly made of fat, salt, and sugar, and then a little bit of mRNA. And what mRNA is a little bit of information that codes the spike protein. The COVID virus molecule itself has lots of little spike proteins, and it makes one of those that triggers our immune system to do its job of protecting us against any further COVID infection. How it works is to get it into the cell to do that is there's a little fat blob, a little molecule that contains the mRNA in it. That goes into the outside of the cell. The little bit of mRNA is read and all of it is destroyed immediately afterwards by the cell. And then that little spike protein is exhibited for the immune system to recognize and do its job. It never goes into the nucleus, and so it can never affect our DNA.
Great, thank you. Next slide. So with the kiddos, the 5 to 11, people are really curious about the sample size and kind of the results and outcomes of that. Can you talk to us about that particular question?
Yeah, so these were a little bit smaller sample size. As I mentioned, the big studies were in adults. However, there were still in this latest round of the ages 5 to 11, there were 2 actual groups that were studied. One was, and altogether, it ends up being 3,100 participants who received the actual vaccine, and there was equivalent amount of placebo. They were studied, the first group has been studied for over 2 months now, and the next group is ongoing studies. They did phase 1 studies to try to figure out what dose would be appropriate in kids this age, and they ended up with a 10 microgram dose, which is a third of the dose given to adolescents and adults. They discovered that this was the lowest amount that gave the best immunity with the least amount of side effects. The outcomes were that about 91% were protected against symptomatic COVID-19 infection in the vaccinated group. And this is pretty equivalent to the other studies and also with the population-wide data that we now have. They also did blood work and looked at antibody levels, and the antibody levels in the kids at this lower dose were equivalent to those in the older age groups. It also had similar side effect profile as to those in ages 16 to 25, which is who they were being compared against.
Thank you. I know a second question that I've heard related to this is the ages, right? You have 5 to 11 that have the 10 microgram, and then you have the 12 and up who have the 30. So how does that work? If you have an 11-year-old who then in 3 weeks is going to turn 12, what's the recommendation for the dosing?
Yes, there's 2 ways you can choose to do it. This is actually not done by weight or by size. It's done by the maturity of the immune system. So typically, if you start your 11-year-old on the 10 microgram dose, we would recommend continuing with the 10 microgram dose for the second dose, but you can choose to give them the full 30 microgram dose if they're over 12.
Great, thank you. Right, next slide. So adverse reactions to COVID-19 vaccines, can you talk about what they are and if they really differed that much from this population, the children population versus the adolescents or adults?
I know that many people probably have already experienced these themselves, themselves, and they were pretty comparable. About 80% in the adult studies and 84% in the children's studies had some sort of side effect, and the most frequent was pain at the injection site. Could also have redness or swelling at the injection site. Others had headache, felt tired, kind of achy, feverish. They typically lasted for 1 to 3 days, and typically came on stronger with a second dose. And we know that this is not giving us COVID. There's no scientific way that it could give us COVID, but it is a reaction of your immune system. And something that works this well, your immune system really ramps up and gives us this kind of inflammation type symptoms. And that's what we're experiencing.
Thank you. Next slide. And this next question pertains to the ingredients and if it's any different for the vaccine for older ages. You talked about the dosing, but how about the ingredients itself?
Yeah, I know that there's been some concern and some talk out there about, is this a different, has this vaccine been changed than the other vaccines? And it has been slightly. Pfizer requested and was approved to do a slight change in an inactive ingredient, but all of the active ingredients are completely the same except for the dose. There is one inactive ingredient that was changed called trimethoprim, and that's an acid stabilizer to help keep the vaccine stable in refrigerator level temperatures longer. It previously could only be in refrigerators for 4 weeks and now can be in refrigerators for up to 10 weeks. And the reason why this came about is because the early storage was mostly in these low-level freezers that most people just don't have access to. So this is a way that we can better distribute to small pediatrician offices. And I know there was some concern about that. It was just this one vaccine, but it actually, the FDA approved it for all of Pfizer vaccines. So their plan is to eventually transition all of their vaccines to include this slight change to make them all more refrigerator stable. And this one change in the inactive ingredient, trimethoprim, is an ingredient that's actually already approved for a lot of other vaccines, including is in all of the current Moderna vaccines. And it's also in other medicines such as fast-acting insulins that we prescribe to patients all the time.
Great. Thank you for that comparison. All right, next slide. So there's questions and concerns from parents about myocarditis or pericarditis. Can you explain what those are and what the risks might be?
Sure. Myocarditis is an inflammation of the heart muscle, and pericarditis is an inflammation of the lining of the heart. And we typically have been just kind of lumping them in and saying myocarditis, even though we mean both of these things just for ease of discussion. And I would say that this is a small but real risk. And it seems to be higher in males ages 16 to 24, and it's typically seen after the second dose. Fortunately, it seems to be more mild than in and kind of just if you get myocarditis out there in the community from any virus, there's always some amount of this happening in our community. People typically recover quickly with treatment, which is mostly Advil, basically. However, there is, from the best I could figure, is probably about twice as likely than the low level you would get just out in the regular community. But that's still a very low level. Twice as likely of low is still pretty low. And I'd like to make a comparison that if you have a COVID infection, the likelihood is at least 16 times more likely that you would get myocarditis or pericarditis. And it can typically be worse, actually. So just something to consider when people are making these decisions for their families.
Next slide. So COVID's not the only illness that we have in the community. We have lots of vaccine preventable illnesses. Can you talk about how the annual COVID deaths in this age range compare to others with the commonly vaccinated illnesses?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting comparison. It was helpful to me kind of in how I think about this as well. That from what we've seen so far, we would expect about 66 deaths from COVID-19 in this age group, 5 to 11 only. That's all we're talking about in these numbers. And compared to other vaccines that we frequently give, that's significantly higher. Hepatitis A would be about 3 a year, a brain infection 8 a year, rotavirus, which is a diarrheal infection 20, rubella 17, and chickenpox or varicella 16. So this is I think this just kind of highlights how important it is to be aware that while overall this has been a minor disease, it is not without some significant risk.
Great, thank you so much. Next slide, please. A lot of parents call and ask, what do I expect for signing up my child for the Pfizer vaccine, and kind of is there spacing between the doses and holidays coming up? That's kind of important to make sure you're in town. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so for the Pfizer vaccine, it's a 2-dose series and they're 21 days apart. We do try to do them as close to 3 weeks as possible, but you can do it a little bit later if you need to, and we still consider that valid. To be fully vaccinated, we say that you have to have waited 2 weeks after your second dose, though. So just take that into account when you're thinking about your holiday travel. We already mentioned this, but if a child turns 12 between doses, you can still give them the 10 microgram dose, or you can choose to go up to the 30. After vaccination, you'll wait for 15 to 30 minutes with your child just to make sure that they don't have any unexpected allergic reactions. All COVID vaccines are available to everyone at this point at no cost. There is an administrative fee that if you have insurance will be charged to your insurance, but none of that should be deferred to you. And if you don't have insurance, then that is taken care of by the government. So nobody should not get a vaccine due to cost. And also, you can go ahead and get any other vaccines that are due at the same time. Right now, many people are getting their flu vaccine. It's totally fine to get the flu vaccine and the COVID vaccine at the same day.
Great, thanks so much. Next question, next slide. So there are individuals who should not get the COVID vaccine, and so I think that's helpful information to share. Would you talk to us about the kind of group where you feel like this is most appropriate for?
Almost everybody can get the COVID vaccine, but there's a few people whom I would suggest not getting it, and that would be if you've ever experienced an anaphylactic reaction, so stopping breathing, to any other injectable medicine or vaccine, or if you've had, say, 1 dose of the mRNA vaccine and you had that experience. Although it's rare, it is possible with any medicine that you inject. Also, if you're allergic to any component of the vaccine, I would not recommend getting it. If a person has had a COVID infection, a natural COVID infection, and they received monoclonal antibodies or convalescent plasma, we're giving a lot of people monoclonal antibodies right now in the community because we now finally have enough of the medicine to go around as an outpatient. If you've gotten that within 90 days, you should not get a COVID vaccine until that 90 days has passed. And then a few precautions, something to maybe talk to your healthcare provider about is if you have ever had swelling of the tongue or lips, pretty significant hives, any problems with wheezing or shortness of breath after getting an injectable medicine or vaccines, I would be sure to notify your healthcare provider before getting this vaccine. Or if you're currently moderately to severely ill, I would probably wait until you're healed before getting the vaccine as well.
And a supplemental question that we has recently come in, just even my own friend group, is people who have been diagnosed with COVID but had not received the monoclonal antibodies. So specifically kids in this case, are they still recommended to get the vaccine? And what is that time period between when they recover and when they should be vaccinated?
Yes, great question. We do still recommend, even if you've had a natural COVID infection, to get the vaccine. It does appear that you have longer lasting immunity with a vaccine than with a natural infection. This is still ongoing research, but we know that with a natural infection, you probably have some immunity for at least 3 months. But after that, it seems to depend on the severity of the infection and the person's characteristics themselves. So we just can't predict who is going to have ongoing natural immunity. So yes, we absolutely think that everybody, including children who've had a natural COVID infection, once they're out of their window of period that they are sick with COVID, which is typically 10 days, or when their symptoms have improved after 10 days, the minimum would be 10 days, then you can go ahead and get the COVID vaccine. It's totally understandable if you would want to wait till after that 3-month period as well. That's totally reasonable. But anytime after that 10-day and feeling better on, one can get the vaccine.
Great, thank you. Next slide. And some of this you addressed just now in your answer to that particular question, but what else should we know about the COVID vaccine that you think is important for us?
Yeah, so we just addressed the first one, and then there's also just thinking about mutations that so far we've been lucky that the current vaccines have been fairly effective against all known mutations, although potentially a little less effective in the case of the Delta variant, although we were also seeing there was some waning immunity towards with some of the immunizations. That's why we've had some recommendations for boosters as well. I know there's been some questions as well about if teens will need boosters, and I don't know the answer to that yet. It would be, if they are recommended, it would be at least 6 months from the initial dose, and it was only approved starting in May for the younger teen population. So I have not heard anything about that yet. Vaccines for younger children, ages 4 to 6 months, which is the youngest that I'm aware of that will have the opportunity to be vaccinated in the future. It's going to be probably at least early 2022 before we hear more about that, is my guess. And just a few other things to remember. Before vaccination, children can often have asymptomatic infections, but they're still able to spread the virus. And yes, even if kids are vaccinated, there is still the chance that they could get infected. Again, it's about 91% effective, but that means there are some that will have breakthrough infections. And we've seen with prior mutations, most of those kids, or most of those, at least adults in the studies we've done, didn't spread very much. With the Delta variant, there was some spread, but it was a shorter window of time. So we fortunately were able to, the vaccination helped with all of that. And so the vaccine should help with decreasing spread, even if there is a breakthrough infection, we hope, at least with our current known mutations and variants. And then to reach herd immunity and to return to normal schooling and kind of get back to normal life, this is just going to be an important component of all of that.
Great, thank you. Next slide. So we have people curious about the children already fully vaccinated. So the age range that just became eligible, is the information is not yet available for us to be looking at, but I know that the state is looking at getting that information. Currently, we have our health district, which is the 4 counties, Boise, Elmore Valley, and Ada, is tracking pretty closely with the national average. And then we just included the Idaho average for those age ranges as well. And this is of the population in these age groups that are eligible, this is how many are fully immunized, meaning they've had their 2 doses and are tracked with this number. So again, like Dr. Mudge said, really important for that herd immunity for as many of these folks to get the vaccine. Next slide. We've had a couple questions, and I can take this one if you want. Dr. Mudge, will the vaccine be required to attend elementary, middle, or high school? And right now it is not listed as a required vaccine for school entry. A subsequent question we get from parents a lot is, will the school be offering the COVID vaccine? And that's dependent on individual schools. We have a mobile vaccine form on our website where any entity, whether you're a school or a business, can go on and request a mobile vaccine in that area. And so, if they do request it, then we can accommodate that need by linking them with a vaccinating provider of their choice. So next slide, please. And Dr. Mudge, I don't know if you want to take a little bit of time to talk through these myths versus facts. I think it's really helpful.
Yeah, we've touched on a few, but we'll briefly go through them. One is that the vaccine is rushed and isn't safe. And I think we've now have a year's worth of data. We have hundreds of millions of people who have received these vaccines. We've seen that overall, these vaccines have been quite safe and have helped decrease hospitalization and deaths in those that are vaccinated compared to those who are unvaccinated, which is the goal. It cannot change your DNA because it does not go to the nucleus of the cell. It cannot give you COVID-19. It doesn't contain a live virus strain. There's no egg protein or pork products or any of those kinds of concerns that people typically have. Like I said, these are pretty simple, basic vaccines. It can't cause severe side effects. Most people, it does not cause severe side effects. There are a few people who have had severe allergic reactions. They typically have had these with lots of other medicines as well. Most people have what we call mild to moderate symptoms that resolve in a few days. And there's also concern that it could make women infertile. This has been thoroughly debunked. There's absolutely no evidence that it causes infertility. And in fact, many of the women who have been vaccinated have had healthy children over this past year, and many women who have had natural COVID infection have also had healthy children over this past year. And in fact, we found recently that being vaccinated during pregnancy actually passes those maternal antibodies, so that immune system protection from mom through the placenta to baby. So baby, once born, has some of that protection from mom. And then it can also be passed through breastfeeding to help baby stay healthy.
Thank you. We've had a couple questions come through via chat, so I'm going to go ahead and ask those to you if that's okay. And the first one's specific to the clinical trial for the 5 to 11. And the question is, were there any severe cases or deaths found in the control group or treatment group during the pediatric vaccine studies?
And from my reading of it, no, there was none. There were only these mild to mostly mild, potentially a little bit of moderate side effects after the vaccine. The only thing that and these were fairly small studies, as I mentioned, 3,100 overall got the vaccine in this age group. We've seen that there has been in that little bit older age group, the 16 to 25, slightly higher increased risk of inflammation of the heart. It doesn't seem like that is likely to happen with the younger age groups, because there's been prior studies to COVID-19 that have kind of linked that likelihood of inflammation of the heart with puberty hormones like testosterone. So that's why it tends to be targeting that little bit older age group, and men more in particular.
Great. You actually answered the other question, was what are the rates of myocarditis in younger children, the pre-adolescents who get COVID?
Yeah, and I don't know the exact rate off the top of my head, but there in this study, there were no cases, and it's expected to be quite minimal, if none.
Okay, thank you. And then I also think we addressed this, but I'm going to ask it explicitly since it was in the chat. So how do we know that it's safe to give this vaccine to a child who already got COVID and has natural immunity? It is my understanding that the study only included participants 5 to 11 who did not have evidence of prior infection.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I agree that I actually do not know the answer if any of those participants had ever had COVID before. However, we know that many people out of those hundreds of millions of shots of Pfizer have had COVID and have subsequently gotten the immunization and have suffered no ill consequences. So I think we can probably infer that there's no issues, but I can't say that there's been a study specifically looking at that I'm aware of.
Great. I know you also referenced the waning immunity from the natural infection as well. That does happen over time.
Exactly.
Okay. Those were the additional questions that I see. So next slide, please. And the next slide really just looks at how to get vaccinated. And we have a call center. If any individuals have questions, they can certainly call us and we can help direct them. There's a couple websites that you can visit, the covidvaccine.idaho.gov website to get signed up, and a provider will contact you to set up an appointment. You can go to our website at centraldistricthealth.idaho.gov. We have a list of providers of where you can find that, those here in Central District Health jurisdiction. And then it will also list on that particular website which vaccines those providers are offering. So if I, as a parent, need to go in to get my booster and I had Moderna, I would know which of those locations would be available for me to get that administered. And right now it's open to everyone age 5 and up in Idaho. So I think that concludes the presentation that we have today. We really thank you all for tuning in and learning more about the pediatric COVID vaccine. We certainly encourage you to talk to your child's healthcare provider if you have additional questions that weren't addressed today, and we just really thank you for your time.
Thank you.